Hello and welcome to Tiny Table Talks, a podcast dedicated to reviewing and discussing board games and video games. My name is Simon, and I am also joined by my excellent co-hosts Claire and Sam. Oh, and Rob is here as well. This week we have 2 more games to review, and we'll also be sharing the board game experiences that got us into the hobby. So please relax, sit back, and enjoy the show. Okay, so the discussion for today that I've come up with is what board game got you into the board game hobby? So, Sam, do you want to start with you?
Yeah, so the game that really got me into board games on a bigger scale than your Monopolies or your Scrabbles and the sort of things you might play as a kid is a game called Eclipse.
Oh my god. Sam, I feel like we've turned up to prom in the same dress, mate.
Well, one of you's going to have to go home and change.
Oh god, this is so embarrassing. Go on, you go first.
It's a bit, isn't it? Okay, so let's start with what Eclipse is. I used to call it space accountancy, which I think is slightly unfair on it, but it does require an awful lot of counting of cubes. But in effect, you build a fleet and you go around a galaxy with the intention of taking it over and wipe your friends off the board and win the game. Is that a fair description, Rob? Is there anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that's fair. I suppose it is quite military based, but that's not the main objective and the only objective of the game. So you've also got to. It's all based on victory points. So you can earn victory points, yes, by winning combat and taking territory, but you can also win them from building certain buildings, some monoliths, things like that. You can also get them from researching certain tech trees or gaining a certain amount of material, currency, I suppose. So yeah, whilst it is military based, it's not the only objective.
No, it is really good fun, Eclipse. I like it a lot, and it's a game that we've played since I started with board games. It's one I've gone back to, and I don't think it's suffered as it's aged. I don't think it's suffered as I've played different board games too much. There is one caveat I would like to put on the Eclipse thing. Effectively, it's a caveat on what I've just said, which is that no game is really taking away the want for me to play it. And that was true until I played one game. And now I have to break some news to you, Rob, that every time we play Eclipse now, I wish I was playing Twilight Imperium.
Yes, absolutely.
Christ. Okay, so first of all, Sam, I'm hurt. I thought we were friends, man. That's cut me deep. Like, I invited you to my wedding, for Christ's sake. Anyway, so yeah, no, I agree. Twilight Imperium is most definitely a bigger game, and I won't go too much into it at the moment because we're supposed to be talking about Eclipse, and I think Eclipse does get dwarfed a little bit by Twilight Imperium because they're very similar games in many ways. And I think arguably Twilight Imperium just goes into a lot more depth in basically every area.
But Twilight Imperium is not a good gateway game.
I totally agree with you, Claire. Yeah, and that's what I was going to go on to say is that actually, in terms of manageable, I mean, once we all knew the rules, we had a couple of weeks where we played it like every week. I think we could get a good game of Eclipse in 4 hours. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I'd say 3 to 4 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can get that done in 4 hours, which means that, you can take a decent lunch break. You can take, you can go outside and see what all the normal people outside are doing and still get an enjoyable game out of it. Whereas with TI, I'm just thinking about, and it was a wicked night. It was the night where we started at like 8 o'clock at night, for example, at the same time we started drinking, and we finished about 3 o'clock in the morning.
We started at 6.
It was 6 until 2, I think, we played.
6 until 2.
8 solid hours, yeah.
I just think that sounds a bit awful.
Yeah, I enjoyed the game. It was a good game, but I definitely it was about 1 o'clock in the morning at that point. And I was thinking, actually, I need to start turning this so I can end this game because I'm falling asleep here and I cannot concentrate on this game anymore. I think it's a long time to be focused upon strategy for.
I would definitely always say if you wanted to start a board game like Eclipse or like Twilight Imperium, your best bet is to do it starting at like 10 a.m. at the latest.
I think you're probably right, actually. Yeah.
Staying with Eclipse, not being distracted, what is it about it that made it the game that got you into board games, Sam?
One of the things that I think makes Eclipse so likeable is that, especially with groups of friends like our board games group, is the immediate nature of the combat. So you don't spend ages and ages just building up finances and doing this. Like, early on in the game, fleets are created, ships are created, and people start shooting each other. And I think that it holds your attention really well, Eclipse.
Yeah, it gets exciting quick.
Some games you spend a lot of time doing a lot of admin before you can start doing things. And there's an awful lot of admin in Eclipse, but at least it hides it behind quite a lot of combat.
I actually kind of disagree with you on that point, and only because of the nature that the combat works in Eclipse is that you decide that you're going to attack your neighbour's system, and you move all your fleets in there, but then you don't actually resolve combat until kind of everyone else has finished taking their turns, and it's almost like the combat is the final thing you do in the round.
That's true. I think more what I meant was that there will be combat within the first 30 minutes of playing the game, whereas some games you might be into for 3.5 hours and still nobody shot each other.
Even if it's just against the pirates, because you might not have actually met a player at that point, but there are pirates that sit on sort of like, I don't know, treasure tiles, sort of like there are various bonuses for you. And if you kill the pirates, not only do you get the system, but you also get the sort of treasure incentive for it as well.
Yeah,
I agree totally with what you're saying, Sai, that the combat, I think there are some odd decisions made there, particularly in the fact that you don't resolve it until the end of a round, which means that if you invade during your first turn, then that player has got 6 or 7 goes in order to defend and react to that. But I also wonder maybe that just adds another element of strategy, which is that, you don't launch your attack until the last moment. And so that the other player doesn't have very much time to counter that.
Yeah, that's true. I also really like in Eclipse that there's a kind of formal mechanic for like making alliances around the table. And what I really like about it is that you basically share a card. I would give Sam my ambassador card, and that would mean that we were kind of in a formal alliance. And that actually then allows you to generate more from your economy. But if you then decide to backstab on that alliance or traitor on that alliance, the card that you receive for that alliance actually flips over and becomes a negative victory point. So there's this interesting mechanic where you can really help each other out economically by becoming allied, and you're very disincentivized to backstab on that. But
there's enough of a disincentive to make you think twice about backstabbing your player, but not enough to make you not do it.
Absolutely.
I mean, that might just be relevant for our particular group, but definitely the enjoyment I get between seeing someone's face and -1 victory point, like the face always wins out, and it's always worthwhile doing.
The final thing I would say on Eclipse, I think, is that the wooden cubes, little painted wooden cubes that are used to, what they're used for, they're almost used as currency, aren't they?
The economy markers, aren't they?
Economy markers. They are so numerous and so fiddly that they just make my blood boil every time I try and play it. Like, I just think that they could have put a little bit of extra thought into how they were going to deal with them markers. Because the system itself seems to work, but it's so fiddly. It's just so many cubes.
I would just like to point out, guys, this is actually where my tiny table comes in really handy, because everyone has to have their economy sheet on different parts of the room, which is if you nudge one of those tables, you only mess up one person's economy sheet. So actually, this is a real bonus for a tiny table. So if you're out there and you've got a tiny table like me...
That is the same justification for having your only toilet in the garden in case your house burns down.
I think players were playing the game well seated, they'd be significantly less likely to nudge the table.
Yeah, as opposed to walking around the living room 400 times each time.
I do. All right, I do also like with Eclipse that it does scale very nicely. So I think it's a game that I think is 3 to 6 or players, and maybe even more with expansions. And I think we've played with almost all of those numbers. And I've never really noticed the having more or less players really impact the game, which I think is actually quite a challenge to pull off.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I would like to say the alien races are quite balanced. I suppose my advice would be, because basically you can play as humans, which is what they suggest if you're playing for the first time, just because everything's the same, there's less rules to worry about. But as you start to get more advanced, you start to learn the game better, you turn the sheets over and you get different alien races that have different perks and things. And my advice really would be to learn as much as you can about that particular alien race before you start playing as them, because there'll be very specific play styles that they sort of force you into. And sort of an example of that, I got sort of the warfaring race, which started with a really big
upgraded ship,
navy, lots of ships, but an abysmal economy. And I didn't have any planets which got me any money, which meant doing stuff was really, really difficult. And obviously what you're supposed to do is march your enormous fleet into lots of systems and take as much territory as you could. Whereas I sort of turtled thinking, well, I'm in a quite good position to defend here, which just basically meant that I couldn't do anything or build anything, and I very, very quickly was overtaken. So
what it really sort of inspired in me when the first time I played it was just how grander scale you can get from a board game. And I'll touch on this on my sort of game for discussion, but it is definitely an echelon higher than a lot of the sort of what you would describe as gateway games. But if you get it with the right group of people who are, interested, it's a kind of sci-fi kind of game theme, obviously with ships and exploration and space and stuff. I think it really sells how expansive and how amazing you...
I think it's excellent as a first proper game to play, not so much as a gateway game, but almost a game after a gateway game.
Why is that?
But the first time I played it, I learnt the game in half an hour, probably less, with it being explained to me. And on my first game, I think I came second. I think I beat Rob, and he's owned the game for years. I think that there's a learning curve with it. The more you play it, the better you'll get if you're not Rob. But at the start of the game, when you start out playing the game, you're competitive immediately. And I think that's something that a first big game needs to be. You need to feel like you're not out of your depth the moment you play it.
Very good. So I guess we've covered you in that case, Rob. Claire, what would you like to talk about in terms of a board game that got you into the hobby?
For me, there actually wasn't a single game that really got me into the hobby. I just started as a child and kept going. So at the age of 10, I was playing Civilization, the board game that supposedly inspired the famous computer game series. And the only difference that I saw between that and Cluedo was the amount of time needed to play. But my most fond memory, the one I'm going to tell you about, is a game called Railway Rivals. So this absolute treasure came out of our attic one day when my father considered us old enough, and his 2 children just went mad for it. The majority of visitors who entered our house were considered as potential playmates. The game has 2 distinct parts. The first part is building your railway network by rolling the dice and writing your railway on the map using dry wipe markers to join up to the cities. And then the second phase is racing, where you race your trains along the tracks that you've built. If you don't have the routes you need to, you can abstain from the race or team up with another player and then split the prize money. You get victory points for winning the race, but you can also spend these on new track if you feel like this will benefit you more in the long run. It's a brilliant game, which tragically seems to have been lost to time. I've genuinely not seen it in years.
And so is it like you're racing multiple times and you're then trying to get the most efficient route to bag the most victory points? Is that how it works, Claire?
Not quite. So there's a number of cities on the map. There's a couple of maps in it because they're just sheets, laminated sheets that you can write on. So one that will be easy to relate to is the map of England. So one race might be Manchester to London and another race might be Birmingham to Leeds. So essentially, once you've already done the Manchester to London race, it's not a good idea to improve that track because that's already happened. But you may well want to think ahead and say, oh, there hasn't been one from Edinburgh to Exeter yet, so I'm going to prepare for that.
Interesting.
It requires a lot of tactics.
Has anyone on this podcast played Ticket to Ride? I know they're not quite the same game, but it's another train game, isn't it?
I can't say I have, no.
Not me, no.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know how they compare as well.
Yeah, Ticket to Ride's taken off as apparently the best-selling game in the world. I'd be intrigued to know what it does that Railway Rivals doesn't, and why one of them has taken off and one of them seems to have found its obsolescence.
I feel like 4 people trying to sort of sell a podcast about board games should probably have played the most sold board game in the world.
Every time you go to a board game cafe, there's better options. I'm saying that with naivety, of course, because we haven't actually played it, but there's always something else I want to play.
Board game cafes, I just think, it's like a kid in a candy store, isn't it? You've only got so long in here, and there's a game which because it's outside of your genre. Like if it's not sort of really strategy and sci-fi based, I don't tend to pay it all that much attention. Which is probably naive of me. Maybe you should. Next time we're in one, just pick a game which is totally outside of what we typically be interested in.
So I want to talk about the game that got me into board games as a hobby, and that's the Game of Thrones board game.
Ah, that's interesting. That's the game I wanted to talk about for the next topic.
Ah, okay.
God, all 3 of us have turned up in the same dress. Yeah. This is so embarrassing, guys.
It's embarrassing. So Game of Thrones is a strategy board game created by Christian T. Peterson, who is also the man that designed Twilight Imperium. So you can see that I've got a type. It was released by Fantasy Flight Games in 2003 originally, but I'm specifically talking about the second edition of the game, which actually came out in 2011. So the game is based on the books by George R.R. Martin and can be played with 3 to 6 people, although there is actually a recent expansion which increases the number of players all the way up to 8, which I feel would be a lot. So in the game, each player takes on the role of one of the great houses of Westeros, vying for control of the 7 kingdoms. In your turn, you maneuver armies across the map to secure the support of various strongholds and castles across the kingdom. The basic kind of gameplay mechanics are kind of reminiscent to diplomacy, although they've kind of taken that theory and kind of added a lot more complexity to it. And I particularly like the idea that you place your orders at the start of each round face down, and therefore no one knows what anyone around them is doing. And it leads to this really excellent brinksmanship of like, you put down a thing and someone goes, well, I hope that's not an attack order. And you go, no, it's not an attack order. I'm just consolidating some power on our border. I assume that token you've just placed is not an attack order. And so the reason why it got me into board games is I think the first time I played this was around 2011, 2012. And in doing research for this, I realized that must have been just as the second edition had come out. But what that was also the beginning of was that kind of height of Game of Thrones fever. So I think the second season of the show had just launched and the most recent book had also just been released. So as a fan of the show and as someone who was reading the books, I was like deeply engrossed in everything Game of Thrones related at that point. And I remember a friend of mine invited me around to play it, and I remember walking into his dining room and on the table was this kind of beautiful map of Westeros that's all divided into segments, and that you've got all of the different iconography of all the houses in their different regions with the Starks and their wolves in the north and things like that. And what I really liked about, I mean, apart from being sort of visually attractive, was also the kind of way that it brilliantly bought the board game and leveraged the theme of Game of Thrones. So there's like a lot of things that as you're playing and you're getting into the mechanics, you realize that this actually fits with Game of Thrones so perfectly. So, for example, the Starks in the north are extremely powerful, but it takes them a hell of a long time to get anywhere, and they have so much territory to defend that they can end up sort of spreading themselves thin. But the way that the map is designed, and this is obviously taken from the source material, is that they have to come down through quite a bottleneck. And if you have another house that's, strongly defending that bottleneck, well, then that can cause a real problem for them. I also like that things like the Martells in the south are sort of known for having lots of resources, and in the books are known for being kind of the wealthiest and having a lot of the sort of farming and agricultural power in Westeros, and that's represented by them having the most access to the supply to sort of build the biggest armies. So the way that it kind of grabbed me with this theme of like, I love Game of Thrones, this is a really cool board game, and then cleverly sort of translated that into gameplay mechanics, I thought was just incredible and really opened my eyes to how those two things can really work, and how a board game can really take its theme and elevate it. And I think since I played that, it got me really interested in what other board games are there out there, not necessarily based on popular books or whatever, but that have that same kind of mechanics. And I know it's a game that we've all played since, and I think you guys have enjoyed it as well. And I'm not sure how familiar with the source material you guys are.
Less so than you, certainly.
Yeah.
But even though, I watched up to season 4, and it was the fight between the Viper and the Mountain. There was the bit where he sort of like pushes his eyes into his skull. That was the point where I'd sort of noped out of it, thinking, yeah, this is just horrendous. I'm not as familiar with the material as you are, but I still enjoyed the game. I think even if you knew nothing about Game of Thrones, you would still enjoy the gameplay.
I definitely agree with that. It's a really good game in its own right.
And I think if you want to talk about, we were obviously talking about Eclipse earlier, and whether that's a gateway game or whether it's that kind of next stage, I think this game, in my opinion, could be either. And I think that if you know some people that are really into Game of Thrones, have read all the books, watched the TV show, but have never played a board game, I think this game would be a fairly easy sell, because you can say, look, you come over, look at this amazing board, you can play as, whatever great house you want to play as, and there's a couple of rules that you need to learn. But I think on the whole, it's quite an easy game to get someone hooked onto, or get someone interested in board games just by leveraging that theme. And then conversely, I think if you're maybe you're not that interested in the theme, or you haven't read the books or something like that, but you have played Pandemic, or you have played some of those gateway games, this one would be a really smooth next step in my opinion.
Definitely.
It also lets people's styles and personalities shine through. So if players are feeling nervous, they can play a defensive game, and that's all right. That's just as legitimate as someone who's playing an aggressive game.
If you're Sam, you can play a dickish game.
And that's just the way Sam is.
Dickish game it may be. I have won the 2 games we've played of this as a group.
Quite convincingly, I believe, as well.
I was going to say, yeah, by a long way.
I think potentially the dickish works on this.
Which is fitting with the narrative of Game of
that
Thrones.
is exactly what I was. That is exactly what I was going to say, and that to me just reinforces how well you can end up with this kind of sense of betrayal and this sense of mistrust around every time someone places an order.
Well, that's as well, because it was some time since we have played it, but correct me if I'm wrong, that there are no dice rolls, are there? It's not done on chance.
No, yes, I think it's all done on power, and I guess the variable that they add to combat to make sure that it can't just be deduced down to just number crunching are the hero cards. And so each of the cards that you have in your hand are represented by characters from the show, and so you might have, Ned Stark would be an extremely powerful House Stark combat card. And one of the things I really like with the combat cards is that as you play them, they become discarded, and you discard a card for every combat that you're in until you've discarded all of your cards, at which point you can then pick up all your cards again. So if you want to play an aggressive game, you will burn through some of your stronger cards quickly, but it kind of encourages you to continually be aggressive, because that way you can pick up cards again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really nice mechanic. I mean, the number of times where I've thrown a hero, because obviously you don't know the hero that the enemy plays until you show, or you've thrown your strongest hero into this battle, which means you lose them, and then your enemy has just played their weakest hero, thinking they're not even going to try and compete. There's
a really nice kind of element of poker to it, where you have to look at the odds and go, okay, well, combat, if it was just a numbers game, is completely a dead heat. So I need to play something that will beat my opponent. And as you described, that kind of scenario where you end up playing a really strong card, and they might play a card that, they lose the combat, but it gives them some bonus elsewhere, because everyone kind of has a couple of those cards in their hand as well. It's very interesting.
They've got the right amount of unknown in this game, I think. Like in comparison to Twilight Struggle, which we talked about in the last episode, where there's just too much unknown. The idea of doing anything tactically just doesn't work. Whereas in this, I think there's just enough fog of war, but not too much, so it's sort of enjoyably playable, and there's definitely a tactical element.
Okay. So that was my sort of gateway game, if you like. So the other topic that I wanted to talk about today kind of came to me in light of the slowly easing restrictions we have here in the UK for the coronavirus, in that you are now allowed to have another household come and sit inside your house instead of just in the garden. And so what I wanted to talk about is any game or recommendation that we each have that works best with 4 people. So I don't know, Sam, if you want to start?
Yeah, so we've already started talking about mine, actually. Mine actually was the Game of Thrones board game. And the reason I've picked that for the best 4-player game, despite it taking up to 6 or up to 8, or I think it is with the expansion.
That's right, yeah.
Is that I think it is at its absolute prime with 4 players. And the reason I think that is the way that the map is laid out. If you've got 5 players or 6 players, you include extra houses, obviously, so everyone's got a house to play as. But where they sit geographically on the map leads to bottlenecks which aren't really resolvable or unlikely to be resolved. And I think that if you're in a situation where you've got the Lannisters and the Greyjoys both playing, to give you an idea if you haven't played it, they both sit in the sort of the narrow bit in the middle of the map. They sit one on an island right next to it and one bang in the middle
They're a
of
bit
it.
too close to each other.
They are naturally likely to clash very early on.
They are, and they sort of stunt each other early on. But not only do they stunt each other, they also mean that the Starks are really going to struggle to get down the map and allow the Martells to just sort of have free roam
Of the south.
at the bottom,
Yep.
which I think is a little bit tricky to I mean, it probably won't affect every game that you play, but it's certainly something that is avoided with 4 players. With 4 players, where you've just got the Lannisters in the middle, I think that the dynamics of where combat happens and the areas that people fight over is more fun
Yeah.
and more enjoyable.
Yeah. So I actually chose Game of Thrones as my recommendation as well for the 4-player board game, with a twist, which I don't think you've played it, but there is an expansion for the game which is based on A Feast for Crows, or that's the name of the expansion. And what that does is it actually adapts the rules for a new 4-player scenario. So you can only play as the Starks, the Lannisters, the Baratheons, and then it also adds an additional house, which is the Arryns, and they're on the kind of east side of the map, which in the base game ends up being quite empty, and actually having another house in there kind of promotes quite an interesting balance of clashes between those 4 houses. And the reason that I suggest it is it actually also changes the victory conditions, and it kind of quite significantly shortens the playtime, which I think is also a bonus for a 4-player game. So the way that this expansion works is that each house has an objective that they can score every round, and it will be specific to their house. So for the Lannisters, I think their objective is to hold Casterly Rock, their sort of home territory, and hold the Iron Throne. And if they hold, or King's Landing, and if they hold both of those, then they will score a victory point at the end of each round. Now, to counter that, the Baratheons, which are kind of on the opposite side of the Lannisters, hold an open objective, which is to hold their castle, I think Storm's End, and also hold King's Landing. So almost naturally straight away, those two will always be in contention, fighting over King's Landing and who has control, because they're going to try and score these objectives.
That sounds good.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting. For me, with 4 people, this is one of the best ways that you can get a lot out of the game. It's also worth just mentioning that they are going to release a digital version of the Game of Thrones board game, I think at some point this year. It was just announced recently. I believe it's just the base game, but I can definitely see the appeal and would certainly be interested myself in getting that. Rob, what would you recommend as the best sort of 4-player board game?
The best 4-player game which I have played beyond Eclipse was Tales of the Arabian Nights, which admittedly I don't own. I played this at a friend's house. Funnily enough, this is Matt again, who came up in the last podcast. And the reason why I picked this particular game is because it's quite different, I suppose, to other games that we played. Typically, the games we play are quite strategy-based, and they are specifically designed around the ability to make your mates' lives unpleasant. This game is far more about building a narrative. It's very, very story-driven. So you sort of travel around the map, and each square you land on, you'll get sort of a different section from the narrative book to read out, and you can make particular decisions about your character. You can make particular decisions about how you interact with the things in the world that you encounter. So, to give you an example, the last game I played, I ended up getting married to 14 different women, and then not being able to do anything else, basically, because part of the game is that you have to then go and visit each of your wives, which just meant I just travelled between each wife for the entire game. It wasn't a very, very exciting game, I will admittedly say.
I love that there's a mechanic built in for that.
Yes, yeah, indeed, yeah. The versatility of the game is enormous. So you got examples. So Matt, for example, told me yesterday. He's undergone sex change as part of this game. He's also become a goat for quite a lot of it. I suppose the narrative is pretty versatile, and you can make ridiculous decisions which lead to ridiculous outcomes.
This sounds hilarious.
It's really, really good fun, yeah.
Would you say Arabian Nights is replayable? Or once you've come across the storylines once, it's not funny because it doesn't have the surprise factor the second time?
Do you know, wonderful question, Claire. No, I'd say it's incredibly replayable because you don't ever read like one narrative. It's not like if we take Gloomhaven as an example, where you sort of go into a dungeon, you read the passage from the storybook, which gives you context for why you're in that dungeon. It's not like that at all. It's like little sort of snippets. So I don't know. Rather than sort of saying, okay, so you're in this location, and then there's these baddies, and they're here for this reason. One snippet would be you're in this location. The next snippet would be there's these baddies, and then the third snippet would be they're here for this reason. So it's highly, highly versatile. I think you'd have to play it an awful lot to ever repeat the story. You might get the same snippets of narrative come up, but you'd never get the same storyline come up.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Oh, clever. No, that sounds really good.
That sounds really cool. Okay, we'll round out this discussion with Claire and your favourite 4-player or your best recommendation for 4 players.
So I've already told you that my favourite game is Gloomhaven. And since that can be played with 4 players, and that's also the number of players that I usually play it with, it's still my choice for this question. However, when we talked about it previously, I didn't explain how the game worked. And so I'll get into the detail now. So you start a game by choosing a closed box at random, because you can't tell from the outside of the box really anything at all about what's in the box. But inside will be a character, and this is then the character that you will play for the game, and indeed many of the games that follow on after that. You embellish that character by naming it, and you will choose a secret mission for it, and only once that mission is complete can you retire that character. So it might actually take you 10 or 20 gaming sessions, so you do get quite attached to these characters. When you get going, you're taken on a bit of a journey. Not as much as Arabian Nights, but there's definitely a storytelling element to this. So you start off in the city of Gloomhaven. It's got a shop, and you can buy nice things for your character, like special swords or fancy shoes. And then you set off for your first mission. There's always a road event on the way, so you might have to stop a riot or help a hermit or something like that. And as a team, you're going to chat about what you want to do. It's very collaborative. And what you do choose has implications. So you might all get wounded in the stampede, or you might help the hermit who chooses to bless you. But he might also urinate on your shoes and give you a disadvantage to start your next scenario. Or give you...
I love that that's actually an example from Gloomhaven as well.
Yeah, it is. And then when you arrive in the dungeon, you inevitably end up in a room full of monsters. That always happens. And your individual characters have to use their individual skills to fight your way through to the end. So they've all got their own strengths and weaknesses. You do have to work as a team, which is why I think it's one of the reasons this is good for the end of lockdown, because if you haven't seen your friends in a while, it's nice not to be pitted against them. It's nice that you can feel that sense of togetherness.
I don't understand that point.
You wouldn't. For everyone listening, the reason that we're laughing at this is that Sam plays Gloomhaven as if it were a competitive game, and is well known for taking all the treasure tiles for himself.
At the expense of the health and well-being of the rest of the team, it might be pointed out.
Yeah, but this is exactly what I think makes Gloomhaven such a good post-lockdown game, because the cowardice or the bravery shown by other players lends itself to ongoing jokes, and the strategy required makes you talk to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all...
No, I totally agree with that, Claire, as well. It would be worth mentioning that even if you don't have the opportunity to get people into your house, there is a really excellent online version on Tabletop Simulator, which we've been playing during lockdown, and I think it's as near flawless as you can get. I've been super impressed with the work of whoever it was who modded it. Do you know, Si?
It's just somebody who enjoys Gloomhaven and is also extremely intelligent.
So it wasn't one of us then?
No, it definitely wasn't one of us.
I think that's really important as well, that the makers of Gloomhaven fully support this. It's not seen as a rip-off of them. They see it as a good way for people to test the game before buying it. So you don't need to feel guilty for playing the Tabletop Simulator version.
I wonder if we should quickly mention that Gloomhaven and its soon-to-be sequel, Frosthaven, I say soon-to-be, in a while, are legacy games, and we haven't actually touched on what a legacy game itself actually is. I think the best way to explain a legacy game is that it's a continuation of the same story. So if you were to imagine that a normal board game is a film, and a legacy game is more like a TV series, but specifically a TV series like let's use House as an example, where there is a resolution in every episode, and then there's a bigger storyline overall, as opposed to something like 24, or a more modern TV reference that I don't have of a show that just carries on and each episode builds on the last, but no episode resolves anything. So it's more like an episode of House or something like that, where you've got a task, a thing that you do, your own little story that adds into the bigger story, but that still concludes each time you play it.
Yeah, very satisfying.
I think legacy games do it differently, but I think Gloomhaven does it particularly well, in that you feel like you've played a standalone board game, but at the end of it, you've benefited, and the next time that you play, you're going to be, you might have a new bit of equipment, you might have a bit more gold, you'll have unlocked something new.
Yeah, it's very
In your case, you might have a lot more gold.
Yeah.
Yeah. You keep moaning about this, but the last time that we had a Dodgy Road event, I bought you all dinner.
No, I know. I paid for my own dinner, thank you very much. You refused to buy me dinner.
I was talking to Simon and Claire.
Right.
I think the other thing to say about Gloomhaven is that although it is intimidatingly large, once someone has done a setup for you, players who actually aren't usually into board games can also enjoy it. So, for example, Simon's fiance played 2 games with us back to back, and it's the first time I've ever played a board game with her. So it's not overwhelming for people that aren't usually enthusiasts.
I think it's unfortunate in a way that the box for Gloomhaven is so big, because when you look at it, even I was like, oh my god, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
And what you quickly realise is that actually the mechanics of the game are very simple, and actually all that box is lots and lots of content. So it's not lots and lots of complication, it's just lots of stuff to do with quite simple mechanics. And I think that's a big positive.
I think the good thing about Gloomhaven, 'cause you get a lot of these Kickstarter games, which are just enormous boxes and a massive game.
Lots of plastic.
And lots of plastic and lots of cardboard and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of them have little flaws in the gameplay and various things that come along with it. And you sort of expect that from first-time board game publishers. It's quite forgivable. But Gloomhaven just works.
Yeah.
All of it just works, and I'm particularly impressed with it for the first proper game that the publishers released. It's very impressive.
Okay, so I think that kind of covers our topics for discussion. So I'd like to move on to the board games that we're gonna and the video games that we're gonna review this week. So myself and Claire have been playing the board game Splendor, and Rob and Sam have been playing the video game Ark Survival Evolved. Claire, do you want to talk a little bit about Splendor?
Splendor is a game in which you're a gem merchant, newly arrived in town, and you want to make a name for yourself. Firstly, by collecting and trading gems, but also by ingratiating yourself with the local nobility. The way it works is pretty simple. On your go, you can either pick up little gem tokens, or use your tokens to buy cards that come with actual gemstones. The more expensive the actual gemstone is, the more victory points that come with it. And if you have enough of these actual gemstones in the right colour combinations, you can earn the attention of a noble, which will also give you victory points. The first person to 15 victory points wins, and this usually only takes about half an hour, meaning that you can play it several times in one sitting. Although it's a short game, I wouldn't say it's light-hearted. The excitement comes from the fact that you're all picking your little gem tokens from the same store. So when one person takes the last diamond token, they're gone for everyone. And more tense still is when you get the right tokens to buy the actual emerald you need, and you have to wait a whole turn hoping that no one else takes it. It's so tense that I want to look away and just play the board as I find it when my next turn starts. But I really can't afford to do that, as I need the time to make a backup plan.
I would have thought, Claire, that you not only had time to design a backup plan, but you would have also had time to design a plan for world peace, to consider whether or not God truly exists, to really contemplate the meaning of life, all before Simon took his turn.
I knew you were going to say that, and I would like to respond in that the game has a very aggressive timer on turns, the online version, in which, if you take too long, you are replaced by an AI for your turn.
Oh, wonderful.
I suppose we need to ask, Simon, did you get booted out of the game?
It happened once.
Are you being honest?
That is no. Honestly, I only got booted once, and it was because I hadn't realised that the timer was running out while I was trying to decide which of my hand of gems I needed to discard, because I'd gone over 10, which doesn't happen very often.
Oh.
both Claire and I pretty much skipped the tutorials and just jumped into a game. And by the end of that game, I think we'd pretty much understood what the rules were and were able to begin sort of competently forming a strategy.
Yeah. I think that's a really positive thing, that you need about one game to learn how to play. And after that, you're good to play by yourself with no more learning required. What I would say, and I don't mean to launch into the negative so soon, but I feel like Simon's already knocked at that door, is that the game is more fun than it sounds, but the rules, when they're explained to you, are so boring that you can't listen. And so when you start your first game, you necessarily have no idea what to do. This happened to both Simon and me after we watched a YouTube tutorial. In my case, I watched it 1.5 times because I couldn't concentrate on it the first time. It didn't really help the second time. I think the real problem is that we don't have a word to distinguish the gemstone tokens and the actual gemstones that come with the cards. And so it's inevitable that people get confused pretty quickly and stop listening. When I first tried to explain this game to Sam, he'd started reading a book before I'd finished talking.
We should probably explain this is a eurogame, which is obviously if you're aware of what a eurogame is, you'd work that out by now. If you're not, a eurogame is... It's a type of almost economic or efficiency-driven board game that was, I think, traditionally Germanic, and in the way where they came from, obviously, it's spread a bit more from that now. And they're games where you are rewarded for making efficient decisions or making the right mathematical calculations to get the right amount of profit from something, or to do something with the least cost to yourself, as opposed to combat or worker placement.
Yeah.
And I have a bit of a problem with Eurogames, if I'm honest, and it doesn't apply to all of them, but it certainly applies to this one. And I think that Eurogames, in the way that they're designed, have a really difficult job getting their story into the game. So at no point playing Splendor, for example, did I think, oh, I'm a jewel merchant. I wasn't thinking about selling jewels, buying jewels in any sort of sense other than just getting victory points. It's very difficult, I think, to add any sort of thematic impact to a Eurogame. And there are some that do it, and I don't think this is one of them.
I think you're completely right, unfortunately. So the theme is so weak that you could change the theme to pirates just by changing the art on the cards. The theme is just completely irrelevant to Splendor.
Yeah, it's literally, I didn't see the theme after about the first game. I was just looking at colours and numbers and working out what colour would get me what number.
Yeah, when you see it described, the blurb that comes with the board game, as a sales pitch, it talks about buying shops and mines and things. And really, that's so irrelevant that I think during your game, you wouldn't even say the word shop or say the word mine. I think the sales pitch has overstated itself rather here.
Yeah, I don't have any actual objection to the gameplay or to the game itself, really. It's the most beige game I've ever played. Like I'm almost opinionless on it. It's just fine. It's no better, no worse. It's just fine. I think it's something to do if you really have nothing else to do.
Yeah, I think the pros for it is that it's very quick and it is quite satisfying if you enjoy a Euro game, if you enjoy that kind of engine building efficiency. And I think that you do get to that point quite quickly. Like the lead, because it's such a short game, the wind up of having an inefficient set of things in front of you is quite a short, like there's quite a short runway until you're up to, okay, well I've already definitely getting 2 diamonds because I bought a diamond mine and a diamond ship, as an example. But
as if you ever thought I've bought a diamond mine or
I didn't think that. I was just trying to add some flavour to it. But I think the thing that kind of works against that is that by the time you've got that engine building going, someone's at 15 victory points and the game's over, and you never really get to capitalise on that sort of process.
It's worth mentioning at this point that I won every game we played and Simon lost every game we played, which in my eyes is a huge plus point for this game.
Oh, that's so satisfying to hear. That's made my day.
I beat Simon as well.
Did you really? Simon hasn't won a game. Oh,
that might be the reason Simon doesn't like it.
I think the thing that I have with Splendor is that it's a very light very light game. Like, I think you could use this as a bit of a gateway game or as an introduction to slightly more complicated board games. I think that the theme is not off-putting, although I agree it's not well used either. Like, I think you could explain it to someone and say, yeah, you're all gem merchants and you're trying to attract, Henry VIII to by getting the most rubies. And someone wouldn't be put off by that and would kind of grasp it quite easily. But I just don't know. I don't know if I ever ended a game and was like, oh yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was just a bit, yeah, that was fine. Like, I can see the appeal.
I've got no inclination to play it again. I don't object to it. I just don't want to.
Yeah.
It would be a good game if you had young kids. Like, I think if you had 7 or 8 plus and you could just teach them the basic rules, I think they would probably grasp it quite quickly.
Yeah, I think Rob could learn this game.
Yeah, that's what I was going for.
Oh. Would you care to guess at how much this game costs?
Oh, I hope it's cheap. That's a really good question. Don't think I would pay. I think £20 would be like the most I would pay for it.
When I thought about this, I thought of it as a little game that came in a little box.
Yeah.
And in my mind, it was £15 max. But I've looked it up, and it costs between £23 and £30 on Amazon, which is 5 or 6 pints.
Oh, I would take 5 or 6 pints any day of the week.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
So the other game we're reviewing this week is Ark Survival Evolved, and that's going to be reviewed by Sam and Rob. So Sam, do you want to give us a little explanation of what the game entails?
Yeah, so Ark is an action-adventure game, or survival game is probably the best way of describing it. And in the game, players survive being stranded on an island, which is filled with roaming dinosaurs, other prehistoric animals, and various hazards. And in certain game modes, other players who are, of course, hazardous. And the game has 2 options. So you can play it PvP, so player versus player, or PvE, which is player versus environment, which is player versus the map almost, and what is included within the map. So we've been playing this for a couple of weeks now, and the way that it starts out, you start out as a caveman effectively, and you need to build yourself a thatch house, and then you upgrade your base as you go. And then as the game develops and you get new technology, which you learn as you level up, you can then tame dinosaurs, and then you can use the dinosaurs to try and help you as you go through the game. And it's quite it's open world, I think, is the best way of describing it. You've got a map which is quite big.
Is there an objective, or do you just play and explore?
So there are bosses that you can go and deal with, but there's no, you're not forced into a game mode. The game is as fun as you want to make it on your own, effectively. Or in this case, me and Rob set ourselves up as a tribe working together and have been progressing through various things, taming dinosaurs, building things. We built a dinosaur garage at one point. That was quite entertaining. So to elaborate a little bit more on what we think of this game, let's start with the bad points, I think, because we don't normally do it this way round, but I haven't got that many bad points on this game. So let's polish them off and then we can praise it for a bit. So bad points, I would say, is that the servers that you play in, so when you start the game, you pick a server to join. You can set your own one up if you want to, or you can just join a mass server that someone else is hosting. We joined a couple of mass servers, and I would say that they were quite laggy. Particularly the one that we've joined more recently is quite laggy. I would say that the server experience on this game isn't brilliant.
In a highly frustrating way as well.
I think I need this explaining for dummies. When you say you joined a server, what does this mean?
Okay, so the map exists for you and for various other players. So you join one instance of this map, which is a server that someone's hosting. You and up to 70 players, it's normally 70 players, will join this server, and you'll all be in the same map. And you all have the same spaces, the same dinosaurs, the same resources to deal with, irrelevant of where you are in the world.
The lag was infuriating in so far as it lets you keep playing, which is good in a way, because it means you can still move around the environment, but it doesn't let you interact with the environment in any way. So you could be sort of chopping down a tree, or you could be building something, and then not realise that it's not actually doing what it should be doing. And then, particularly, I know in the combat side, Sam, as well, you were fighting a dinosaur as the game was lagging, which means that neither of you can deal out any damage because the server's not keeping up to date with what you're doing. And then you also jump from the position that you think you're in back to the position the server thinks you're in, which means that you put yourself in a really good position, the position you want to be in, and then suddenly you jump. So I was, for example, stood on top of our house building it, and then suddenly I jumped from the top of our house into midair just beside our house, and then fell to my death, which is quite frustrating, especially as when you respawn, unless you put a bed down, which if you do that then you can respawn in the same place, but when you respawn in a random location, so finding what you were doing again takes some time.
Yeah, the servers themselves, even before you join them, I don't think give you much detail. We joined a beginner's server at the start because that seemed like the sensible thing to do. And it doesn't explain at any point that the beginner server caps the level that you can get to. So when we put a few hours into that, we sort of thought, okay, we'll just stick on this for a while. And then we just stopped progressing because the game was capped. And it doesn't explain that anywhere. It doesn't give you that much detail about what each server's little nuances are, because whoever's hosting the server can change various settings. It doesn't really tell you what settings they've changed. I wouldn't say it actually detracted too much from the experience. It's just, it's information that I think I'd probably like to know.
Agreed, yeah.
Some other little bits which I think are mildly infuriating, but not, well, I don't know. They are a bit infuriating. When you build, the way that the game is set up, you can't build things close to where other people have built things. And I think that as a mechanic, that's a good idea. What I don't like is that it's encouraged other players to just go and build singular little things, just like a little box or some sort of pointless entity, all over the map as soon as they join, so they've got areas they can return to later, which I think can only really be described as knobbish behaviour.
I'm not necessarily sure that's necessarily the intention of the player, because I'm just thinking when we first logged in, the amount of times where you'd build your foundation, thinking, you've been searching for half an hour, 45 minutes for someone to actually build somewhere, and then you find it and you build your foundation, fantastic, we've got the foundations to our house, and then you get eaten by a dinosaur. That happened to me a number of times, which meant that I've got just a square of foundation just lying around, which I could never find again.
And I think that would be fine if it was always foundations that I found dotted about, and you think a dinosaur has killed you. But that's often not what I find. I just find what I assume is the cheapest thing you can make, that people have just built and plonked down somewhere so they can return there later and build whatever they want to build there.
Reserve the space, yeah.
And I think that, obviously, that's something that's very difficult to police. I just think this is a message to all ARC players, is just stop being so selfish.
That's really all the negative things I have to say, to be honest with you. I don't have anything else to say negative on this game. Have you, Sam?
Not really, no. I think what I would... Yeah, I mean, all of the negative points that we've just discussed aside, I should probably make it fairly clear that I love this game. I think it's brilliant. I've sunk so many hours into it over the last 2 weeks, and I suspect even after we finish recording this that I'll sit here for another couple of hours and play more of it. I think the options it gives you, what you can go around and do in terms of building things, in terms of attacking things, fighting things, taming things, I think it's been so well thought through that it's impossible to get into this game, even if you have the mildest interest in this sort of game, and it not hook you.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying, Sam, because they keep the gameplay really fresh, because actually when you look at the base gameplay for what we've done, I'm sure there's probably more than this, it's probably about 50% building, 50% sort of exploration, fighting, that sort of thing. So the building system in itself is highly intuitive. I thought a little bit of a pain in the arse sometimes, perhaps, but on the whole was intuitive. And also the resource collection, where you've got to go out and chop down trees to get wood to build your home. I didn't find that was too grindy, so it wasn't boring, basically. And then the way that they've done that is that you go out, and once you've chopped down a tree, it weighs you down, so then you can't move around as quickly, which means it would be a bit of a pain, because then you could only chop down 1 or 2 trees before you've got to go back to your home, place your wood, and then go back up to go and chop down some more trees. What you can do is you can construct the things that you want to build whilst you're still out in the forest collecting your trees, and then that doesn't count towards your weight, which means that there's not this constant toing and froing. You can chop down 2 trees, build a load of stuff, chop down 2 more trees, build a load of stuff, and then go back to your home and actually place all that stuff, which I think is really nice, because one of the big issues I think with these survival games is that you are just constantly collecting things, and it's just running back and forwards, which gets quite tiresome quite quickly.
Yeah, they've certainly prioritised gameplay with this game as opposed to the crafting and building side of it. So you can build things as quickly as you can. You can craft things in your own inventory. There are certain things you need to like build something to build something. But it's all done quite easily in the same way the research is done. You get these research points every time you level up, and you just spend them to research things. The crafting itself is such an improvement on a game. So let's take the original Skyrim game as an example. I really liked that game, but the crafting and the learning of crafts to build armor or to build axes or whatever it was sort of sluggish and time consuming, and you had to like make a real commitment to do it. And I think that's just something they've got right in this game. You don't have to. It doesn't feel like a chore, whereas in the first Skyrim game, it definitely did.
Please, can you tell us a bit more about the taming and capturing of dinosaurs? Because from my perspective, watching you guys play this game, this has been the most amusing part. Watching you guys fail and also succeed, and the excitement, and even watching you guys watch YouTube videos of other people failing to catch dinosaurs.
Yes, I will explain how to tame dinosaurs in a second, but I should say that if anyone's listening to this and thinking about playing, there is a collection of beginner tutorials on YouTube by a chap called Royale with Cheese, and they are very funny, particularly the first few beginner parts. Everything he tries to do just goes a little bit wrong. They're fantastically entertaining, and if you want to learn this game, I'd recommend learning it that way. It's how I did, and yeah, put a smile on my face. Taming dinosaurs is done. It depends a little bit on the dinosaur, but for the most part, you have to knock the dinosaur out with like a blunt weapon or narcotics or other things as the game continues. And then you go into its inventory, which is effectively its stomach, and put berries or meat or whatever it is that this particular dinosaur eats. And it'll eat them while it's asleep. And if you feed it enough that it doesn't wake up between the taming meter going across as it eats and its unconsciousness meter going down, then when it wakes up, it will become your dinosaur.
We might need to talk about Bob. So Bob was very much Sam's first love, and he fell deeply in love with this animal. In fact, just to give you sort of an idea, when we logged onto this game, this is the beginning server, so it was one of the first games we played, and Sam finally captured himself Bob the dinosaur. I sort of thought, it'd be quite nice to log on and have a chat with a mate while we play some games. This will be really lovely. But all I hear for that entire session was, oh, Bob, that's probably a bit uncomfortable for you. Oh, no, well, I'll just make this a little bit bigger for you, Bob, because that's a little bit tight there. And, I'll tell you what, Bob, I'm just going to raise the roof a little bit, just so you can probably stretch out, because, I don't want you being cramped or anything. And then he'd go off hunting with Bob, and all I'd hear is, oh, God, Bob's hurt, Rob. And then I'd come running out, and Bob was like 2 HP off of full health, and Sam would have to nurse Bob back to health. Now, I think probably the reason why Sam raised the fact that the beginner servers are level capped, and they should tell you that beforehand, was because it meant that we had to leave Bob behind, and I think it was a really emotional moment for Sam.
He's probably still there on that server in his dinosaur garage. I remember leaving the door shut. He's probably run out of food by now. Poor Bob.
I'm sorry, man.
Starved him to
sorry.
death.
Oh.
The best compliment that I can pay to this game is so I haven't played it myself, but I did join a chat while Rob and Sam were playing it, and I just sort of overheard what they were chatting about as I was minding my own business. And every now and then I'd ask a question like, "Can you fly? Can you like tame are there flying dinosaurs?" And Sam would be like, "Yeah," and I was like, "But you're not going to be able to actually like fly in the ride the flying dinosaur." And the answer was always, yeah, you can. And honestly, it started out as a joke, and the more and more questions I could come up with about, like when you were talking about Bob, and I was like, "Have you just called it Bob like in conversation?" And they're like, "No, it's the name. The name of the dinosaur officially in the server is Bob." And I just every question I could come up with, the answer was pretty much, "Yeah, you can do that." And I think that's an absolute ringing endorsement for that kind of open world, sandboxy type of game where the answer is always yes.
Yeah, very, very much so.
Yeah, it's excellent. There's so many fun features to this game. One thing that makes you think a little bit is, I started talking earlier about the fact that you log out and everything carries on. But it means that you want to get back to where your base is before you log out of the game, which has led to some situations where I've needed to be somewhere, but I was on the other side of the map and thought, well, I probably should run home before I log out, as opposed to just logging out in the middle of this field. I mean, maybe it's personal preference, I don't know. Which meant that I've been late to things because I haven't been able to leave. I had to say to my housemate quite recently when we had people round, do you mind opening the door because I haven't yet quite finished taming my Triceratops and I need to walk him home?
I mean, that's the kind of sentence that sells games to me.
It is. And I mean, I could go on about how much I like this game forever, really. One note I would say to anyone listening to this who thinks this sounds really good, there is currently a Steam sale on. The RRP for this game is £45. There is currently a Steam sale on. It's $8.99. And for that money, for 2 pints, it couldn't be more worth it. To be honest, for £45 for 10 pints, or whatever we'll say that is, I'd be considering it. I must say I didn't pay full price for this game, but I think I might. If I didn't have it and I'd played it as a trial, I really would consider paying full price for it.
Wow.
It's a fair point, isn't it? Yeah, I totally agree with you, Sam. I think $8.99 is an absolute steal. For the depth of the gameplay that you get, it's an absolute steal. And also how communal it is. You can get a load of you together working on the same thing. I think it's a highly sociable game.
I've noticed that you've both put in vastly more hours into this game than is actually required to review it.
Yeah, and I think we'll continue to put hours into it from now on. It's excellent. Well, I do like the fact that you can work together in it, because every now and then I'd log in and Rob wasn't online at the same time, but he'd been online a couple of hours earlier, and you'd notice that he'd put a new staircase in, or he'd built a little veranda, which was quite nice. We very quickly established that between the two of us, Rob was very much the
homemaker,
the homekeeper.
Yeah.
I think you make rather
Sam
a
would
sweet
go off and hunt dinosaurs, and I'd be like, oh, I know, I'll upgrade all our walls to stone.
It was the very clear division between hunter and gatherer.
Yeah.
Like, it never had been more clear.
Yeah. Sam would come back with like a Triceratops over his arm, and I'd be like, oh, hello, sweetie. There's dinner on the fire.
Oh, that's absolutely lovely.
I can't wait to try this game. That concludes the third episode of Tiny Table Talks. If you'd like to get in touch about anything we've said today, or perhaps request future topics for discussion, or offer up your thoughts on a game that really shines with 4 players, you can tweet us at tinytablepod, or you can email us thetinytables@gmail.com. We will return in a fortnight with a classic Eurogame review, a galactic construction behemoth, and will continue to make further unhelpful observations on the size of Rob's tiny table.